Look, it's simple, and I don't know why it's so hard for you to understand. Manchester City never breached any financial rules, but in case they did, those financial rules were discriminatory. This is the ArsenalVision Post-Match Podcast. My name is Elliot Smith, block me on Twitter, Yankee Gunner. Yeah, look, it's really that simple. They did not breach the rules, and they certainly did not breach them 115 times. But on the off chance that they breached them somewhere between 1 and 115 times, the rules were extremely discriminatory, and the entire Premier League should be burned to the ground as a result. In any event, as you can probably guess, we're going to cover a bit of that today. We'll also cover some transfer rumors. Amadou Onana back in the headlines for Arsenal. Maybe we can talk Sesko a little bit, but I do have to contractually, I'm obligated to tell you about all the fantastic stuff that has happened on our Patreon. So the 72-page slide deck thing for the data review is there. If you were into that sort of stuff, you're going to want to check it out. Tim, who you'll hear from momentarily, did an oral history of the 1952-53 season when Arsenal won the league on goal average, and the sort of era that kicked off, Whittaker's era, the trophy drought, 17-year trophy drought. There's a whole lot of good stuff in there, and really, really exceptional. And someone came in the Discord to say, hey, my granddad was in that team. So, what a community this is. We do have Benjamin Sesko pod, Benjamin Sesko scouting video when? One. And Clive and I are doing Benjamin Sesko scouting video 2 tomorrow. We'll probably throw in a couple other players that are most strongly linked with Arsenal, which will be determined probably as we log in tomorrow, because that is always changing and updating. So lots of stuff happening there. Wish for everyone that you could get a chance to be in there, but if you can't be in there, you're here, and that's what's most important. But also it's important that you're there, but really glad you're here. I hope that makes lots of sense. And the LA event will be announced soon, so we look forward to giving you details on that, but it'll be obviously during the period where Arsenal are in LA. That really does make the most sense. And with all of that out of the way, the nonsense, and me having said I love you and thank you for being here, I can introduce to you Tim. You can find him on Twitter at Stominator. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
And Jacob Hawley is back. I believe you can find him on Twitter. Is it Hawley Jacob, if I remember correctly? Did I do that right?
Yeah. I don't use it very often, but yes, I am Twitter Hawley Jacob.
Well, maybe I can lure you back by letting you know that now they allow porn on there. So would that tempt you back?
I didn't realize that had been. I didn't realize that was ever illegal. I thought that pussy in bio was very much part of the Twitter experience nowadays.
I think you just summed up Twitter, which is this thing that's now allowed always seemed like it was allowed. So there you go.
Yeah.
I do want to know, like, first of all, the genitals in bio thing. First of all, they're never in the bio. I clicked for educational purposes. They're never in the bio. I also want to know, like, does that work? Like the people who respond, like, free game in my Telegram. Are there people going to Telegram to get a free game and then like, oh no, my bank account's been drained? Who saw that coming? I don't know.
You've only got to get one person though, Elliot. That's the thing. It's like those emails you get and you think, who could possibly believe this? You only need one person.
That's true. And my mom is out there waiting to be that one person for every single phishing scam available. So, Mom, don't click the Telegram link, please, if you're listening. I love you. Okay, we should talk about something less funny, which is the imminent collapse of the Premier League. Manchester City have basically decided that they're going to just try to burn it all down. Now, I think if your goal is to show that you are innocent, taking the Lance Armstrong approach is not necessarily strategy number one. But for those of you who don't know what I mean, when Lance Armstrong was being accused of all this doping stuff for his, 7 Tour de France victories, whatever it was, he then sued all the people claiming he had been doping, saying, how dare you disparage me in this way? And City have kind of gone with the same, we are innocent, so innocent, in fact, that we're going to sue you to prove that the rules that we did not breach are discriminatory. And to essentially sum this up, if you haven't been following, and we'll try not to cover it breathlessly, but it is really important, so I will take the somewhat sardonic tone out of my voice eventually. These rules were introduced by the Premier League to prevent related party transactions, essentially. And you can understand why they'd want to do this. Just bear with me for a moment. It's essentially saying, hey, look, you can't have a entity that you also own or influence sponsor you, because how on earth can we evaluate what that sponsorship really would be worth if it was transacted in a free and fair marketplace, right? You could say, hey, it would be like if my wife says, hey, Elliot, I'm going to give you $500. She hasn't given me $500, right? She's given me my $500, right? But just as if I give her money, I'm giving her money. It is really just that similar. And so I saw an analysis done by an independent organization. For example, they looked at one transfer window and they sort of said, here is what Manchester City on the books valued these sponsorships at for that year, for that calendar year. And here's what the independent auditor valued it at. And the delta, the difference in those values, paid for their entire transfer activity that summer. Well, you do that every summer, and you can see the difference, right? The ability to buy all the players you want, just in the difference in revenue you're reporting between what you actually should have reported and what you did report. So this is a huge problem allowing this to happen. And it isn't just City, by the way, who would fall foul of this. Chelsea, right? These multi-club ownership models or investment type owners that invest in lots of other businesses. We know that Chelsea sold themselves a hotel, basically, right, to try to get free of some PSR challenges. So this is a long preamble, but I think it's an important one to set up where the battle is. The battle for the 115 charges is coming this fall, as I understand it. But this battle, coming in a couple weeks, is a separate legal battle brought by City to say these interested party transaction rules are discriminatory and shouldn't be allowed. And they are suing the Premier League for damages for this, right? And to essentially eliminate these rules as well. And I do want to say, you're always the good guy when you say, and if we have to abide by these rules, which this is something they did say, we're just going to have to bring up ticket prices and fund the women's team less. Always good to use your fans as the threat, as the shield against these kind of rules. So like I said, a lot of preamble. I appreciate you bearing with me, but I think it's important to set the table for what we're talking about. And with that, Tim, let me start by saying this. None of us are legal experts or finance experts, and we'll try to get those on. So let's try to take it more in the context of what the ramifications of this are. And we'll go big picture first. How sort of existential do you think this is? Is it breathless, typical internet reaction to say this could be the end of the league as we know it, which, you got some journalists writing? Is that more accurate? How significant do you see this as a watershed moment in the relationship between City, the league, and the future of the league overall?
I think in terms of the relationship, it's pretty seismic, because what a lot of people lose sight of, sorry if I'm repeating myself here, the Premier League is the clubs. That's kind of all it is. I think people think of it like it's Barclaycard or something. It's just the clubs, and there's a guy, Richard Masters. All right, it's more than just one guy, but and it is an organisation.
It's one guy in his basement, in his underpants,
who just looks after them all. Who's got a giant Guna style like computer setup.
By the way, I will cut across you to say that one of the funnier breaking things from this is people are reporting that Arsenal are the ones that turned in Manchester City, and someone did a funny screenshot from The Wire with the Arsenal badge over the face from The Wire saying, "Get the word out on the street. I want them to know it was me."
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy with Arsenal as Serpico, to be honest. But yeah, in terms of the relationship, yeah, of course, like it's kind of a civil war, because you sue the Premier League, you're suing the other clubs, basically. Yep. And in one respect, you could say that's quite a ballsy move, because this is never going to happen, right? But if City were expelled, for example, nobody would really miss them. It's not like if like a club like Arsenal or Manchester United or Liverpool makes that kind of threat. That's different. It shouldn't be, but it is, because of the interest in the fans that they bring. City don't really bring those things, and therefore they're not as valuable, really, to quote unquote the Premier League brand. And in fact, one of the reasons I think the Premier League has gone so hard on a lot of the charges, I don't think the Premier League have had an attack of conscience over where money comes from, or even really cheating that much. I don't think they probably care that much about it. The other clubs do, of course, but I think it's because they recognise that turning the Premier League into the Bundesliga is damaging for the brand. That's what they're getting at. And the other clubs, and I'm certain that the likes of Arsenal and Liverpool are very, very much behind this. They don't want that either, and they're protecting their interests and everything like that. So in terms of the relationship, yeah, I think it's pretty seismic. Legally, I don't necessarily think it is. I think that this is an attempt to gum up the legal process, basically, and this is a way of exhausting the Premier League's resources, of taking their focus away from, to your point, Elliot, in the kind of autumn when these charges are supposed to be heard. It's a way of just like lobbing another boulder at them and saying, "Go on, deal with that one," and taking their attention away. And this is what people with limitless wealth can do, quite frankly. So I'm not sure that it's legally going to be that significant, or that anything that significant. Like I don't think City are going to aren't going to get chucked out of the league over this. I think what will happen is it will just lead to a bit of a cold war, to be honest. And I don't really see how it's resolved, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it is. I do agree with you, by the way, that this follows a really time-tested tradition of wealthy organizations papering the opposition to death, right? In other words, let's tie you up in litigation, take your focus off the core activities. And in this case, they're taking their attention off the 115 charge case, which is a big one coming in the fall, presumably, by having them look at this distraction one. I do want to send some credit to City, though, who have somehow characterized the democratic approach of the Premier League, where a certain number of clubs have to vote on any initiative, as, quote, tyranny of the majority. Tyranny of the majority, showing their deep American political roots. The Federalist Paper number 10, written by James Madison, talked about a tyranny of the majority, hence why America has a bicameral legislature, including a Senate, which is made up of 2 representatives from every state. And there's your civics lesson. But
there is an interesting crossover to Trump here, though, isn't there?
It is a bit Trumpian in its claim, for sure. I think one of the things that is, first of all, I have to say distasteful is, I think, portraying this as discrimination. You do hear sometimes people say, well, it is. Look, you have, billionaires from the West, white billionaires who own clubs don't get this kind of attention. And let's be clear, right? The issue here is not that, a Middle Eastern run club can't run a club, can't even spend big money. It's that they must spend according to the rules as they exist. And what makes this difficult is when a state owns a club, when the revenue comes from the state, there are so many scenarios where it can be difficult or impossible to regulate their behavior, because the state can say, hey, do you want the water filtration contract for all of the properties in our country? Well, one way you could start being a better bidder for that is if you were a major sponsor, the water filtration sponsor for the Citigroup clubs, and things like that. And there's just no way to differentiate that. Whereas, like, you just don't see that kind of behavior in traditional business operations. So that is a problem. And so I think the claim of discrimination is a distraction tool to try to obfuscate, to try to keep the conversation somewhere other than why this really is a concern. And so, Jacob, I really do think that this has the potential to be existential. Now there's rumors that they might run off and join a super league as a result of this. But I think they're setting up the battleground here, because clearly if they are found guilty on more than 5 or 10 of the 115 charges later, something close to a relegation type penalty would be coming, you would have to think. Just using the multiplier of what they did to other clubs. And so if City believe that's coming, then a preemptive strike and threats like this, and we've already heard some issues that maybe the UK government and their government are discussing how they can get out from under this to keep relations good between their countries. Like, do you see this as trying to kind of threaten the Premier League out of pursuing too assiduously the 115 charges?
Maybe. I mean, I've got to be honest. When I saw you in London, we spoke about this, Elliot, that I'd heard some rumours that it was coming, that the penalty was coming, and that the league really wanted to deal with City quite heavily. And that, there was rumours of 80-point penalties that would ensure they're relegated, blah, blah, blah. And I've always been really sceptical of that. I really have. I've always been really sceptical of the idea of that. But there's just so many things that are happening right now between this attack from City on the rest of the league, and then you start piecing that together with other things, with Pep's future suddenly being in doubt when it hadn't seemed to have been before, with De Bruyne being linked to the Saudi Arabian league and seemingly wanting that kind of move. And then you start looking at executive level of Omar, I forget his surname. Moving from City to Man United, and that's another really interesting thing about this. By the way, there's, as you mentioned earlier, the rumours that Arsenal and Edu are part of the team that are fighting City, and you start to think actually there's a lot of people who maybe know quite a lot of stuff about the inner workings of Manchester City, who might now be fighting against them, who might now be in the camp of a Premier League who don't want this anymore. And for the first time, I'm starting to look at this and think, maybe City know that something is coming. Maybe City are aware that something big might come, and they are starting to prepare the groundwork for how they deal with that. And you've mentioned already the rumours that they could look at joining the Super League. I mean, interestingly, I think the only two clubs in Europe who are still up for doing the Super League are Barcelona and Real Madrid. I think Juventus recently pulled out of it. But it does shape quite an interesting future for what Manchester City might look like over the next 2 years, and how they're preparing themselves for that, and who's going to still be involved. Because the more you look at it, the more it does feel like rats seem like leaving a sinking ship, you know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And by the way, like, I think this does all tie together a little bit with the other clubs that are connected to this. I'll explain what I mean, because related to the discrimination point, right? Like, City suggests, this was discrimination to prevent, our ownership from being able to break into the cartel of the traditional big clubs. But first of all, like, as Chelsea proved, you can break into that cartel. They cheated as well, let's be clear, in their own way. But, the rules have been updated since then. But the argument that it was discriminatory doesn't hold for a simple reason. I'll give Giant Gooner credit for pointing this out. They could have spent within the rules and still dominated. They could have dominated without having to break the rules. And that's sort of the thing that is lost here. Because remember, the 115 charges aren't just they breached PSR, they breached FFP or anything like that. It's the concealing and the hiding and the lying and the breaching with the breaches and the 115 breaches, and they did the breaching. There was a lot of stuff done to conceal this, to basically act with impunity. And so the argument is, hey, you wouldn't let us act with impunity. That is true. But you still could have dominated without acting with impunity. Now, what's interesting here, Tim, is Chelsea, Newcastle, and supposedly Everton lining up to come to City's defense in some way, or provide some kind of testimony or evidence in support of City. This reminds me of the 4 dragons meme, if you've ever seen it. It's 3 mean-looking dragons and 1 really clown-looking dragon.
Someone tweeted this morning that Everton have got that air of like the guy that works 9 to 5 that retweets stuff like billionaire mindset.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you got a 9 to 5 job, but yeah, you're on that billionaire grind. To be fair, like 7-7 Partners, if you looked at that, like they do own another club, I think in Australia, but I don't even think that ownership is going to go through. So we'll see what that's all about. But like, you can understand why Chelsea and Newcastle would. Chelsea clearly have related parties that this would be an issue with. Newcastle, similarly, we understand that that's, state run in many ways. And so if they can get these deals knocked back, I mean, you look at Newcastle, I believe their shirt sponsor is Sella. Is that right? Which is definitely a real company that definitely does real estate. So, that's definitely legit. And there are no questions to be asked there. But what do you think about this, Tim? Like, is there a civil war potential here between particularly Chelsea, Newcastle, and City and the rest of the league in terms of, hey, this is fundamental to how we plan to operate and want to operate, and we are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder to try to get this knocked back?
This is the bit that I can't work out, because when I first saw the story, I thought surely City would approach particularly Newcastle in advance of this and kind of ask them if they want to come on board. Because, you got one club with owners with limitless wealth, throw another one in there, you can really gum up the legal process then. So I was a bit surprised. Like, I was thinking, have they not asked Newcastle, or did they ask Newcastle and Newcastle have gone, no, like no one's looking at us at the moment, and we haven't done anything yet. We might just take a little back seat on this one. So that's what I find quite strange. So I can't quite get my head around this story, because I would have thought, because this is not something that City have just done this week. This goes back to earlier this year. So like there is, you know what I mean? Like I don't understand why those ducks weren't lined up. I completely understand why Chelsea and Newcastle would want to come on board with this. I assume they would, because they want to do the same thing, essentially. Everton, I think, are keeping their options open, because it looks like the 777 thing has bitten the dust, and they're still trying to sell the club, and maybe they'd like to sell the club to someone who'd like to do something like this. So they're I think Everton really, billionaire mindset and all of that are kind of like, maybe someone who wants to do that wants to take us over, and therefore we don't want to do anything that would discourage them from taking us over. So I'd imagine that Everton are a bit more like on the fence really at the moment. But yeah, this is the bit I can't get my head around, why or how this wasn't done before in the months that have led up to this. So I don't know whether that's just a rumour or a story that doesn't have a lot of foundation, or maybe some of these clubs were like, you know what, why don't you throw that grenade and we'll see how it lands, and we might not, type thing. We'll kind of see the lie of the land once you've scorched all the earth and all of that. And so that's the bit, to be honest, Elliot, that is a bit of a mystery to me, because if you'd told me a couple of weeks ago that this was coming, I would have thought, I bet Newcastle and Chelsea are on board with this and will kind of join hands in this. What was it Reagan referred to? The axis of evil.
Exactly. Yeah, might have been Bush, but yeah. Yeah. Look, I have to admit, I find the discrimination claim really distasteful, because in general, I think everyone can acknowledge that discrimination, racism, all of those things, bigotry, are huge problems in our society generally. And to leverage it in this way is so grotty and despicable, because there is no hint of racism and discrimination at play here. He says, being a white Westerner, male, I understand. But like, my point is, this is savvy from City, right? Because they know these things aren't just tried in the courts. They may have no chance to prevail in the courts, but they are tried in public opinion. And what is the whole city exercise? It's an exercise in soft power, right? So if they can try to get into the zeitgeist that there is an anti-Arab, anti-Middle Eastern discriminatory element to this, that may make them more sympathetic. And I find it distasteful, because that diminishes the actual types of discrimination and racism that exist in society that we should really be mindful of. Oh no, poor state-funded billionaire, football club is being discriminated against because their owners. No, I'm sorry. We're not going to let that creep in here and undermine actual efforts to eliminate discrimination and racism where it exists, to the benefit of, billionaires who have taken state funds. And I think that is another component that I want to really emphasize. Even if you fall into the camp of there are no good billionaires, okay, the false equivalency thing, I get it. But like, when you're using state money, it's different, because of the commingling of governmental authority and power and intergovernmental relationships and the wealth of the people of a nation versus, even if you think the ill-begotten wealth of a business, it is just fundamentally different. And I think we should make sure to underscore those differences. And if you disagree, of course, you always know where to find us. We can discuss it. But like, I don't care for the use of discrimination in this case. And I can see very clearly through the transparent effort to, I think, again, obfuscate and move the conversation. And Jacob, like, this leads to a question that I think is difficult. I think one of the worst things you can engage in as a fan of a club is having a go at fans of another club, because we're all tribal and we think we are the true fans and we are the fans who act properly and all other fans act terribly. And that kind of discourse very rarely goes to a good place, but we're going to try to do it anyway. I don't know if they're sock puppet accounts. I don't know what a real Manchester City fan is. I don't know if I'm talking to real ones online or if I'm talking to fake ones or whatever that qualifies as. But like, you say anything anti-Man City in this respect, and you get a lot of angry City fans in your mentions. And I'd like to think that if Arsenal were engaged in something similar, suing the Premier League to remove rules that are designed to create some semblance of not even fairness, just transparency, right? It's not even about fairness, it's just about transparency. That if we were doing that we would be up in arms about it. I do know that when the Arsenal tried to join the Super League, we very much protested that. I say we, like a huge chunk of the fan base did protest that and went out and forced to show that. Do you have a reaction to City fans reflexively defending their club in this situation? Like I said, I understand it is tough for an Arsenal fan to have an opinion about how City fans behave, but that is part of the story. The tribalism in sport protects clubs from their bad behavior quite frequently.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So so to give a bit of background, over the last year or so, I've sort of started doing more football content, and I regularly do a show called The Kickoff on YouTube with other football fans, and It's
By
the
the way, I'll
most
stop you there.
time
That
I've
is I'm going to just say that's an up and coming video platform. You can check it out at youtube.com. That's youtube.com. Okay, go ahead, sir.
But it's the most time I've ever spent listening to fans of Chelsea, Tottenham, Man United, Man City, Newcastle. And what you really learn is that every group of fans assigns themselves an identity, right? We think of ourselves as being we think of Arsenal Clarsnal. We do things the right way. We always have. We grew up on Professor Wenger with his nice football and promoting people from the academy. Blah blah blah. Manchester United have their own idea of that. Chelsea fans quite like the idea that they're the rich guys who chop and change managers all the time, and they always have these big nasty players who tackle yours. And what's been really interesting over the last few days is I've been trying to read more Manchester City stuff. And by the way, I've been trying to get a read of Manchester City fans for years. Last year, when we were in the title race with Manchester City for the first time, I thought I'd try and listen to a Man City podcast to try and sort of go behind enemy lines to get an idea of who they were. You know how the Athletic do the handbrake off and they do a Chelsea podcast, United podcast. Last season before this one, they gave up on the Manchester City podcast in February of their treble-winning season because no one was listening. That tells you everything you need to know about their fan base. But what's interesting is over the last few days, reading City fans on Twitter and going, "Oh, your identity as a club is victims. You think you're victims." And if you look at the language around all of this, we're up against the elites. You are the elites. You've won 6 of the last 7 Premier League titles.
Are we the baddies?
Exactly. They've got this insane idea that they're victims. They've got this insane idea that everyone else is bullying them because they've got more money than us. I saw one City fan, I wish I could remember his name, credit to him. He was writing on Twitter, he was like, you know what, guys, I've enjoyed the last few years. I've enjoyed the success. I've enjoyed the trophies. But it is tiring, isn't it? This guy was saying, he was like, it is tiring constantly having to argue on behalf of our owners, constantly having to fight other fans who never appreciate our success, who never appreciate the beautiful football we play, the amazing players we bring to the league because of how we've done it. And all the other City fans were underneath his post going, but this is us, bro. This is what we have to do. It's part of being a City fan. That's what they've become, and all of this attack on the league, it all feeds that. Like I completely understand it and agree with what you're saying, but the language they use, this discriminatory, it's really ugly, and you're completely right to call it out, mate. Because what it does is it means that actual acts of discrimination fade into the background because the loudest, richest people are using the word incorrectly. But the other words they're using, the attack against the elite, we're trying to disrupt the powers that be. You are the powers that be. You're the richest person at the table. And I don't think that's an accident. I think they would have done a lot of work looking at the way City fans identify themselves, the characterization they use of their own fan base. And all of this feeds into that. And it's creating this weird siege mentality of the most successful club in Europe that they've been hard done by.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? You raise a really good point that I had been thinking about too, which is like, he says, to try to attach himself to it. Their history of being sort of a small club, a downtrodden club, is something they hide behind when they want to assert that they are the little guy, right? Like it's this weird thing. It's like they really are a sock puppet or a Russian nesting doll. So inside this shell of what Manchester City are now is this little doll of what Manchester City were years and years ago. And when they get attacked by anybody, especially supporters of a traditional big club, that little doll pops out and is like, but I'm just the little Manchester City up against the big guys. Yeah. But then they like hop back into their shell of being state-owned. It's like, so
they try and find the Paul Dickov shirts from 20 years ago to remind you that they were in the championship once, despite the fact that they've been winning the league for the last 15 years.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I get it. I get it because historically they may still feel that that's the core of who they are. But like, this is why they should be upset. City just stuffed that in a box and turned it into something else with the veneer of success. And this is why I think the discrimination thing and all this stuff is nonsense. And this is why the whataboutism is so unproductive. Well, your billionaire owner also owns a company that also sponsors this sort of thing that goes on. Like, all may be true, mate. It's all true. None of that explains why Manchester City would not follow the financial regulations of the league they're in and are now suing the league to remove the regulations that prevent them from circumnavigating those very rules. Like, that's the focus. It is so hard in the internet age to get someone to just focus on the actual issue. The fact that another big club may be owned by another person who owns a business, whose other business did a thing that's distasteful, is both true, and maybe it's gross, and maybe it's a gross part of our modern society. But none of that changes the fact that there's this one club that is state-owned, that is using their resources in a way that breach or allegedly breach financial regulations, and now they're suing the league to remove regulations that would make it harder for them to do that. And it's that simple, and that's the issue. And I want to end this topic on this, Tim, which is simply that, like, there is this possibility that none of this is existential. But I kind of think it is. And the reason I kind of think it is because I think the hammer is going to drop here. These 115 charges, one of two things is going to happen. Even like either England, the government, is going to say, we got to sweep this under the rug. We've got some bigger issues if this goes through, and it all goes away somehow. Or there's going to be penalties and there's going to be punishments. The City are not going to prevail in this case. That is my view. That there is no case here. This is a distraction technique. This is to change the narrative. This is to try to get control of the media cycle. Remember, the thing that makes City very different than other clubs, people, is that they are not engaged in a business activity. As gross as it is, Stan Kroenke owns Arsenal for one reason. It's a shiny bauble. It's an asset. And maybe that asset will be worth more when he sells it eventually. But that makes him very predictable. That makes his incentives very clear. City-owned Manchester City's owners, it's an exercise in soft power. That's very difficult and slippery because it's about burnishing reputation. That's much harder to understand what the incentives are. So, Tim, I don't see a world where City are just going to sit back and allow themselves to be relegated to League One, later this fall or whatever the case may be, and have this whole project fall apart. I mean, it is possible that if that happens, they just go, well, our soft power exercise is over, and they just leave the club, pull all their money out, and the club goes into administration and is gone, which would be sad, by the way. There's the possibility that they do try to pull out and say, we're now 100% behind the Super League, and it gets back on the table. Do you want to sort of prognosticate quickly on the impossible, but what is the outcome of these now two litigations, and if there is a risk that if City face actual consequences, there's sort of an existential crisis for the Premier League? And I will simply add that this is where the American model is quite unique. You have a very centralized league structure in something like the NFL. An NFL team can't just sort of sue the NFL in this way and break it all up and change its rules. They are member participants, but they are centrally governed in a much stronger way. But the exchange for that is you don't have promotion and relegation. It's not a loose membership. It is essentially a tight membership, centrally controlled. Is there the risk that to prevent future activities like this, the Premier League explores a more American model and that ultimately we lose the football pyramid altogether?
Yeah, definitely. I think you've kind of struck at, if you really wanted to go like deep into the Earth's core on this is essentially what you've got in the Premier League is kind of genuflecting a battle between an American model where, the American model's like, why don't like 15 of us get rich? But it's the same 15 and no one else can ever break in, compared to a much more monastic model, which is like, we have everything and screw the rest of you guys kind of thing. And it should be said that neither of those models is particularly laudable. It has to be said. So I do think, and what have we got in the Premier League? It's majority American owners, right? I forget
with close. It either is majority or it's close.
Yeah. I forget with like the relegate. I don't think any of the relegated teams were owned by American money, but like I think more than half the teams in the Premier League. Like essentially, the Premier League is at or close to an entire voting block of American owners. Like once you hit 14, you've got a voting block right there. And I do think there is something significant in that. And I do think there are all of these kind of soft power tensions in football between UEFA and FIFA and blah, 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 and how the Premier League should run and blah, 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 etc. And I do think there is a lot of that going on. And I think essentially this is almost like a Rocky movie, basically, except it's not Russia anymore. All those guys pulled their money out for completely unrelated reasons.
Let's not portray the American billionaires as the underdog Rocky, though. That feels a little bit wrong.
Well, but obviously Rocky is like loaded with nonsensical propaganda and things like that. And, there's not many Chinese owners around these days either, is there? Like not many Chinese billionaires own football clubs anymore. That's a bit odd. So, this stuff does reflect geopolitics and soft power and all of that. And that is essentially what's going on here. And I'd just say in closing, just so this isn't three Arsenal fans whinging about Manchester City, which I'm all for.
Totally in for it, yeah.
I think we should acknowledge, what would we say and think as fans if it was Arsenal, for example, and be honest with ourselves? Like, would we be like, fuck Arsenal? No. I kind of don't think we would. I think we'd have a lot of fans who'd go, yeah, go Arsenal. Yeah, we're the underdog. And a lot of people would probably be like quite uneasy and a bit quiet about it. And I think we should also acknowledge that I think there is a discussion to be had about the Americanization of the model and how difficult it is to break in. And I don't think we should have a model where a club like Manchester City needs a wealthy nation state to own it for them to be able to compete. But obviously they are now in a position where they do not belong to that argument anymore, right? That argument belongs to like Nottingham Forest and Luton and Sheffield United. Well, Sheffield United are owned by their own Middle Eastern billionaire who's looking to sell up. But you know what I mean? Like that argument belongs to those clubs now, not Manchester City. But there is probably an argument to be had about the lack of competitiveness and the fact that we have gone to a stage where Manchester City and Chelsea could never have won the Premier League without having the funding that they had. And that's not healthy either.
So I want to just say one thing that's kind of ironic, though, Tim. The ironic part of this is in an American model, the individual member clubs are profitable. The profit is shared throughout the league. You actually don't need to invest endlessly to be successful. But to your point, the same group of teams remains in the league permanently. The irony is the American model doesn't require something like nation state ownership in a sense because the clubs are self-funding and self-sustaining and actually generate profit. The irony of the football model as it exists, the pyramid model, is because it's totally unregulated in some ways, other than these PSR rules that are loosely applied, as we've seen, is that the only way to really get to the top is to spend an immense amount, lose a lot of money, generate revenue that, if you don't generate it, you're bankrupt or you're outside of PSR rules. And it is a huge roll of the dice, right? Because look at it, Chelsea. You spend and you spend and you spend, and you're like, well, if we get in the Champions League and if we get the right sponsorships, then we'll be within PSR rules. But, oh, whoops, we didn't get Champions League and now we're outside and we got to sell all our players and we're bankrupt. Like it is a very bizarre model in terms of the financial incentives. I'll let you weigh in on that final point, though, Jacob, which is simply, do you see this going to an existential place? I think what makes it hard for me is I can't conceive of a world where City just lose these battles and take it on the chin, whatever the punishment is. And I don't know how far they're willing to go to prevent that from happening. And look, maybe I'm being naive. Maybe the outcome of all this is it will just be settled and they'll get something like a 15-point or 20-point deduction, which they can easily ride out and probably still make Champions League. And then we go on. I mean, maybe I'm being incredibly naive about them ever being fully punished. But because I can't see them accepting punishment in this way, do you foresee some existential change, whether it's a Super League exit for them, a change in the Premier League to be more centralized and closed so that there's just more central control and ability to prevent future situations like this? I mean, how bad / different could it get if this goes the wrong direction,
Well, when you say bad / different, do you mean bad / different for us as fans of a club in this Premier League?
Let me. Sorry. So you're right that I put a valence on the way I said that I don't intend. How existential could it be in terms of a change of what we currently have?
Well, I personally, I think this is mainly going to affect City, and I see a lot of this as City preparing themselves, their fans, and the team for what's coming. That's what I personally believe. Do I think this is going to cause huge changes in the league? I kind of hope so. But I know change is a scary thing. I know when we all read headlines going, this could be the end of the Premier League as we know it. Good. Because look at the way it's going. Look at how, like, if next year, we're going to get onto Arsenal in a minute, and we'll talk about how optimistic we are for next season, and I think we should be optimistic. If next season is Pep's last season as the manager of Manchester City, and say they don't get a points deduction, do you really think anything's going to get in between him and his final Premier League title? And then that'll be 7 of the last 8. Like, we should want change. We should want something to disrupt what's going on at the moment, because it's getting worse. And it's not just getting worse from the sense of being, bad for us as a competitor to Manchester City who want to win this title. Like, it's getting less watchable. I spoke to fans of other teams. No one was watching City's games in that run-in because it was so inevitable. There was nothing exciting about watching Chris Wood miss chances as they slowly beat Forest, or watching Tottenham basically fucking roll over and let them have their bellies tickled. Like, no one. This should have been the best run-in in years. This should have been a 3-horse race. The narrative around Klopp, Arteta's second chance trying to dethrone Pep, and it wasn't watched. If you look at the TV ratings for Manchester City's final 5 fixtures, they were the lowest that they've been for City in the last 5 years. That's why the Premier League are acting now, because people have stopped watching. And no one likes to hear the Premier League might change forever, but we should want that, because right now, the direction the Premier League is going, it's getting worse and worse year on year. And, as Arsenal fans, we've been at the top of this Premier League with City for the last 2 years. It's been great. Do we feel really optimistic that we might dethrone them next year? We should. And do we really? Honestly? I don't know. Like, I don't know if any of us sat here are willing to bet that we would win the league next season. I kind of agree with everyone who doesn't want the league to change forever. I understand it's a frightening proposition, but it shouldn't stay as it is either, because it is turning into a Bundesliga. It's becoming less watchable, and that is completely down to the way City use their resources.
Yeah, this is where I think you have to be able to hold 2 ideas in your head at the same time, 2 different ideas. And unfortunately, in the internet age, that's not always the easiest. Idea 1 is Pep Guardiola is probably the best manager in the history of modern football. City have amassed one of the most talented teams the league has ever seen. They play sensational, dominant football, and what they've done is nothing short of incredible. Because let's be clear, setting aside the way they built the team, it still doesn't mean you just walk out on the pitch and you get 91 points, 97 points, 100 points. What they've done as a footballing achievement is incredible. Incredible. And Pep has earned the accolades. Hold that idea in your head, but hold in your head at the same time that they have been able to do that, to keep Pep, to amass that talent, to insulate themselves from injury and from misses in the market through an outrageous amount of spending that allows them to have a squad that Pep can put out every week, twice a week, that is capable of playing his football at the level he needs them to. And when they miss on a major signing, when Grealish is $100 million, but he's actually just a squad player, it doesn't hurt them. When Calvin Phillips can't play at all, it doesn't hurt them. Right? So the 2 ideas are not contradictory. What Pep has done and what their team on the pitch has done is absolutely extraordinary. We've never seen anything like it, and it is an achievement. It is an achievement tainted by the fact that the squad that was built allegedly through breaching a lot of the financial controls designed to prevent this very kind of not dominance, but distortion. Distortion is the word I'm looking for, because it is a distortion. And for the City fans that point to, well, you weren't complaining when Liverpool were dominant in the 80s, or City, United were dominant in the 90s and 2000s. Well, first of all, it wasn't like this. But also, sometimes that did happen. But it happened through operating within the rules as they existed. If you think those rules are unfair and designed to create a cartel or create, a sort of discriminatory group at the top, that may be the case, and maybe that needs to change. But it's like the person who goes to court for violating a criminal law that they knew existed, and their defense is, well, the criminal law wasn't very fair. That may be the case, but you knew it and you broke it. If you commit a crime, whether you think that should be a crime or not, you must be prepared to do the time, so to speak. Okay, let's talk about transfers. I want to be clear. That's a difficult topic for a non-City fan to cover in a way that doesn't come across as tribal. There are people who listen to this who may not be Arsenal supporters who feel it was too tribal. There are people that may feel it wasn't tribal enough. It wasn't breathless enough. I can't say which way you're going to react to it. I can say, to Tim's point, I'd like to believe that we would not feel good about our club doing this. I don't know that for sure, but I think it is a seismic moment. It does feel like a seismic moment in a league that feels like it's needed a seismic moment, to Jacob's point, to maybe engender some kind of change that may be scary, but change that may be necessary. Because they're sleepwalking into a problem. And they've been sleepwalking into this problem for a long time. And now they've got one of their member clubs in open defiance of them, basically saying, you do not have the right to rule us. You do not have the right, through democratic processes that you agreed to, that you knew existed. Now they're saying those democratic processes do not have the right to rule them. It is the equivalent of, I'm taking my ball and going home. I don't like the rules, even though I knew them. It didn't work out for me. It's rage quitting. It's a problem. We'll see what happens. I'm sure we'll cover it again and as tediously as we have today. Now, before we switch to the transfers, I will tell you this podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is not just therapy, online therapy. It is therapy. I think the thing for me that's really simple with this is that if you want access to therapy, you have to ask, are you able to find a therapist near you? Are you able to get in the car and drive there? Are you able to spend the time in the office? Do you feel comfortable being in the office with a therapist? And then do you have time to drive back? Are all those things going to fit into your life? And for a lot of people, even if they could theoretically do it, it's enough friction to prevent them from doing it. And that's a thing that you should want to do, right? Which is have someone you can talk to, get things off your chest. Maybe it's about, a team and a league that doesn't follow the rules and it's really upsetting you. It's a thing you could talk about. Maybe it'd be something more serious. But the point is that therapy is important, and having easier access to it is just a nice thing. So you can go, you can find a therapist you match with, you can leave the camera off if you want to feel a little more comfortable. You can do it on your time without having the extra time to drive there and the extra time to drive back. And I think it just makes something that's important more accessible to match with a licensed therapist and get it off your chest. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/vision today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/vision. Do it now. Tim, is that enough of that?
Indeed.
Nailed it. Okay. Jacob, I'll start with you. Onana from Everton, back on the radar as of today. He's young, and so we don't want to summarize a young player's only ever being one thing. And I think the danger I have to avoid is what I did with Declan Rice a little bit, which is I saw him playing suffer ball at West Ham, and I thought the guy's a really, really, really good player. But is he technical and passy enough for Arsenal's system? Because he was playing in, David Moyes' suffer ball system. And I think that there is the Sean Dyche-ness about Everton that makes it hard to evaluate a midfielder. So when I say Onana, do you think clunky and a little too uncultured as a player? Or do you think there's a silky Arsenal player in there that we just need to discover and he's the right guy for us, or something else?
Slightly more the former, to be honest with you, mate. Last summer, I had reservations about the David Raya transfer, largely because I heard that the goalkeeping coach was kind of behind it and he didn't have a great track record in terms of bringing in Runarsson for us. Looking at the links to both Sesko and now Onana, I am starting to wonder if Nicholas Jova has been given the checkbook to decide who we sign next, because it seems to be just get big guys and put them somewhere near the box for corners. I watched a bit of Onana this season, and I do think there's slightly more in there in terms of the way he uses his feet. I do think he's certainly got some techers, as the kids call it. I don't know if it's quite what we need in midfield at this moment in time. The other links between Bruno Guimaraes, between João Neves, they seem to be much more technical players that would help us with ball progression. And I feel like that's what, especially, I don't want to necessarily say the left-hand side, because I think Declan Rice is going to veer towards the left a lot more next season in the way that he did at the end of this season. But I think our attacking players need someone who's going to get them the ball a bit quicker from midfield. And I know that when Partey came back into the team, we looked so much more open, and he didn't look like he could run. But there was just a few times that he played those line-breaking passes that got the ball to Saka a bit faster, that got the ball to Havertz a bit faster, in the way that Jorginho did a few times really well this season. And that was the thing that I felt our midfield missed. I didn't look at our midfield this season and go, we need another big guy to counter-press. Do you know what I mean? I was looking at it going, I'd love it if there was someone who could help us transition a bit quicker, who'd get the ball into the winger's feet a bit quicker. So yeah, it's not quite what I'd been hoping for in midfield, but in Mikel we trust.
Yeah, I think it's always tough to summarize what a player is going to be when they are. I mean, he will be 23 this summer. At Lille, I am told he showed a little bit more of that silkiness. I don't know. I haven't seen yet. I guess we could do a scouting video on him if these rumors persist. I do worry, Tim, as you know, I'm a worrier. So my friends call me Whiskers, that if we get an Onana and he becomes, let's say, the 6 and Rice becomes the 8 and we move on from Zinchenko, there's a lot of ball progression taken out of the team. Because Jorginho was the data review showed this brilliantly. Jorginho was our leading line breaker passer. Zinchenko was our second. Zinchenko was our leading progressive passer. And I think Jorginho was our second. So if you don't have Jorginho in there, or Partey, who's quite progressive, and you don't have Zinchenko in there, and you have Rice, Onana, and let's say Tomiyasu sometimes if Timber's on again, off again, you've just sucked a lot of line breaking passing and progressive passing out of the team. Now maybe Onana can do it. That's going to be sort of the question. But I wonder. It is always hard when you have these sort of 6s playing at teams that don't use the ball the way we use the ball to anticipate what they would look like in a team that uses the ball more. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think with the Onana links, it depends what else we're going to do. If that was it for our midfield transfer business in the summer, I'd think, because Onana actually scans to me a bit more like Rice, and I feel like maybe that's a Rice understudy more, particularly, to the point. Like I feel like a much bigger priority in the midfield is that kind of Jorginho, Partey, veers to the right, but kind of, when it's a box, he's on the right of it and Rice is to the left. And when Rice goes off, it becomes a diamond and all of that, like much more your kind of deep lying playmaker type model. I think and suspect that's more where Arsenal would want the majority of their money. Like that to me could be a guy who comes straight into the starting lineup at the beginning of the season, whereas Onana to me, from what I've kind of seen, and my impression of the player is a bit more Rice-like. So if that's the intention, I don't know what the cost would be of that, but if it's a kind of, we're building a bit of mitigation if we don't have Declan Rice because Emile Smith-Rowe's going, maybe Fabio Vieira's going, and we need like a bit more resilience in that position, I think that would make more sense. If that was it, I'd find it a bit odd, I have to say.
Yeah, and I'll just give you data, and then Jacob, you can come back on the ball progression. This is interesting, you guys. Jorginho over the last 2 seasons has averaged almost 10 progressive passes per 90. Declan Rice for Arsenal, about 7.7. Onana, 4.5. And the season before that, less than 3. So, again, it's hard to tell because of the system he's been in, but it is worth pointing out that you would be you'd be losing about 7 or so progressive passes per 90, which is a lot, by the way, not to mention all the ones you'd be losing Zinchenko. So ball progression would certainly be something to consider. Now, would we be even more outrageous out of possession and be nearly impossible to progress the ball against us, and our progression would come from winning it back and pressing? Is there certainly some of that? What do you think, Jacob, about ball progression and losing that forward momentum?
It's something that I think you and I spoke about it, actually, Elliot. It's something I was thinking about a lot in the first third of the season. It was something that when we were playing Havertz in midfield with Rice and Ødegaard, and we were sort of changing that was the thing I really felt was missing when we weren't quote unquote clicking. I think a big thing that we've maybe underestimated is how much Jurriën Timber was brought into this squad to counterbalance that. And we don't actually know where he was going to be placed to do it. There's so much talk at the moment that he's going to be our left back. I'm not 100% sure that was the plan. It might be now. And I think that's something you have to credit Arteta with, that he's very good at changing his plans as things go on. I don't think Havertz was ever planned to be our 9, and that's what he became. And I think you have to credit Arteta for deviating from his plans to allow that to happen. If you look at Jurriën Timber's numbers from his last season at Ajax before he came to us, he had some of the highest ball progression numbers in Europe. Now, granted, that was in the Dutch league, but when you actually watch what he was doing, and especially where he was doing it, if you look at his heat maps of where he was, it's exactly where Partey was for us in our 22-23 season. Now, I don't know what we're going to do. And if you remember at the start of this season, the way that we were configuring the back 5 of the pitch, we were inverting from the right-hand side. We were inverting Partey from the right back position to go into midfield there. So I think we have to leave our minds open to that he is going to be a really key part of our lineup next season. And that is very much his game, is adding ball progression to a side through dribbling, through passing. And I don't think we can underestimate how much he's there to do that. So if someone does come in who doesn't tick that box, I think we should try and remember that Timber does. And we haven't seen the extent to which he can yet. But I really think he's going to be massive for that for us this season.
Yeah, this is a time of year, too, where it is really hard to know what is agent talk trying to drum up a market, right? And when people know a club needs a certain area, a certain position, they're going to link you with it. So we're going to get linked with forwards and central midfielders a lot this summer.
The Onana links have been pretty consistent, and Everton...
We have scouted him for sure. Yep.
Yeah, and Everton look like they're in a position due to PSR where they have to sell players before June 30th. So,
Yeah, and by the way, I think we have re-signed Jorginho, obviously. We have Rice, Odegaard, Jorginho. Kai can play in midfield a little bit. Onana's not going to be cheap, but he's also a player who can come in and not have to be the guy right away in the way Rice needed to be the guy right away. And it is interesting. I mean, for those of you who want to say, by the way, though, that, when he steps into our midfield, he'll do totally different things than he did before. Declan Rice is instructive, actually. I mentioned 7.7 progressive passes this season. That's one more than the season before, and not even half more than the season before that. So Rice improved his progressive passes over the last 2 seasons. He was at West Ham by about 0.75 passes per game. We'd need Onana to come up, probably to double what he's doing currently. And again, that's all very data driven. The other thing we should point out is guys like Rice and Onana carry the ball forward. So their progressiveness comes through carrying, but I don't think everybody in your team can be a ball carrier. You have to have, the ball moves faster than any person does. So you do need to have someone who can ping those passes, break lines, things like that. And so, but this is the beautiful thing about football, right? It's kind of whack-a-mole because you solve one problem and another problem pops up, and then you try to solve that problem, another problem pops up. You don't solve it unless you have endless resources, but thankfully nobody has endless resources. We don't have to worry about that. The Onana thing we'll track. Let's set that aside for a bit. You mentioned Sesko, Jacob, and you mentioned it in a way that was sort of sardonic, so I don't know if that's an opinion about the player or an opinion just about Jacob Hawley wanting his tall kings. Not Jacob Hawley, pardon me, Nicholas Jover wanting his tall kings for set pieces. So is it tall king summer? Do you like Sesko? I think we've covered him a lot. So we've done a Patreon pod on him, a scouting video on him. We're doing another scouting video tomorrow. So I feel a little clearer to weigh in on this player than Onana, but what's your take?
It's very hard to talk about any subject on this podcast because you have to remember that you guys do about 7 podcasts a day. So you've covered every topic 9 times with 9 different panelists who watch more Arsenal
than I did. We did talk about Sesko on the 7 a.m. pod today, but the 9 a.m. pod had no Sesko mentioned, so you're clear.
Yeah, but I'm gonna join Clive for the rewatch of that podcast to sort of discuss how you discussed it. Sesko, the rumours have kind of grown on me, to be honest with you. I at first it wasn't something I. It's the area of the pitch, the front line, the front three. I think we need a ceiling raiser rather than a floor raiser, in my opinion. The midfield, I think a floor raiser is okay. The defence, I certainly think a floor raiser is okay. I think we need something a little bit better in our front line. And I don't know if Sesko replacing Eddie's minutes is enough. Do you know what I mean? Now, that ceiling raiser might come in the form of Martinelli returning to the form of a 15 Premier League goal winger. It might return to Jesus being something like the player he was in his first 12 games for us the season before last. It won't... That alone, Sesko alone being added to our front line won't be enough for me to convince me that our attack has got enough in it to do next season. The irony with that, though, is numbers-wise, we've got a lot of players there. Say we were to do what we expect, if we were to lose Nelson, lose Eddie, add Sesko, you start counting, you go, right, we've got Trossard, Martinelli, Saka, Jesus, Havertz, and Sesko, and I'm saying I'd want one more on top of that. It's a lot of players. So I do wonder if we were to add one more, say if I wanted a winger like a Pedro Neto or someone like that, I wonder if someone has to go. I wonder if we'd have to move Jesus or someone similar.
Yeah.
You start counting and you're like, even with losing 2 players, there's still a lot of forwards there.
Yep.
It's the one area of the pitch for me where we need less numbers and just a bit more quality. And I'm not sure if Sesko at the age he is ready to give us that.
It's a tough one. I think Sesko is in that hard to evaluate space of you can see there's a huge ceiling there. But you can also see there's a raw player in there that needs to develop. And what makes those signings really, really tricky is, does a 20-year-old player develop playing 800 minutes a season? Do you ever get to the ceiling if he's only got 600 or 800 minutes a season? Or do you have a player who regresses and never hits their potential? By the same token, is he a player that's ready to play 2,500 minutes a season for a team that wants to win the Champions League and the Premier League? That is what makes Mikel's job and Edu's job so tricky this summer. Because you can't stop planning for the future just because we're in a win now mode. But if you buy players that aren't ready to play in a win now team, are they ever going to develop into what you think they might be in the future? And Tim, that's the problem I have with Sesko. I'm right on the fence over this. I see a player who could be a star, but I would say that he's not that player just yet. And yeah, there might be, if Eddie goes and Nelson goes and Smith Rowe goes and we clear out a bit, maybe even Jesus goes or a Trossard, something like that. There might be 1,000 minutes for him to play. Will a 20-year-old striker who's learning his craft develop into what he needs to be with 1,000 minutes of playing time and training with a good team? I don't know. But I also don't know that I would say Sesko is someone I'd want starting regularly, given that we know the margin for error at Arsenal is very small. So how do you balance the need to keep future planning, bring in players with a bright future, but also they may not get exposed to as many minutes of playing time as they need to develop into that bright future?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. I've never seen, I don't think I'd ever heard of Sesko until he came up on my Twitter timeline as someone we're linked with. So I can't really comment on the kind of quality of the player or anything like that. I think it's interesting for two reasons. I think one, again, if it's like an Onana type signing, I mean, on one hand, that would make a lot of sense if it is like the Nketiah replacement. And to Jacob's point, we're going to sell Jesus and that's how we're going to raise the ceiling here. But at the same time, that's still quite expensive. And it's the same for Onana. Like for Rice backup, that's expensive, essentially. So I'm kind of dubious about that. So I don't know if that says something about the striker market as it is. But what I'm kind of more interested in is this says to me that Arteta has seen Kai Havertz up front, and that's how he wants to play. He wants that player, or like a good impression of that player up front now that, he's seen the light, as it were, and it's like, okay, this has really unlocked a lot of things for us. And if Havertz isn't playing up front, I want his slightly bigger, slightly ganglier younger brother playing up front, doing an impression of Kai Havertz. That to me is what's really interesting. Or is it because we're going to buy another striker and actually we do want Havertz in midfield, but we really like what Havertz had bought us and we always want that option? Like, I'm less convinced by that. I think this is a kind of stylistic lurch where Arteta said, this is the kind of player I want, because the only thing I can really make out from Sesko's kind of the little videos and stats I've seen is that, as well as being a rather large gentleman, he's apparently a very good dribbler as well. And actually bringing both of those things, that's quite rare in a striker profile. And but equally, it could be, to Jacob's point, it could be Nicholas Jova just looking at FB Ref, looking at height,
sorting by height,
filtering 6'4" and aerial duels 1, and that's where all the money's going this summer.
I will tell you, the one thing he will do that Kai will not do is he will kick the living crap out of the ball. He has an absolute cannon for a leg. He can shoot with both feet. Lot to like, but I think it is dangerous because people have to temper expectations if he arrives. He's not the finished article by a long shot. I want to ask you about one more player. And by the way, since we've been recording breaking news from the Premier League that VAR is going to stay in place, which Tim will celebrate later, they've put out a list of all of their focus areas. We're not going to do a podcast segment on them because the focus areas are like try to be better at it. Try to be a little better at it. Try to communicate how we're being better at it. Continue to try to be better at it. It's nothing more than like we're going to continue to have a high threshold for intervention, which means they'll let more wrong calls go, which is exactly why we brought VAR into the game. But they will try to communicate better with the people at the stadium as to why they've let the wrong calls go. Jacob, final point. Ethan Nwaneri. This, I think, is a real challenge for Mikel. And I don't mean a challenge as in he's bad at it. I mean a real legitimate challenge. Not much of a pathway for academy players currently, and not much opportunity for academy players this past season. When you're an eighth, there's a hell of a lot of ways to get academy players into your team. When you know that dropping a single point can cost you the title, and you're trying to beat Bayern Munich in the quarterfinals of the Champions League, things get a little more serious. You could argue that an academy player training with the first team currently has more value in their development than playing for the first team 5 years ago. I mean, literally, I think you can make that argument. But it still remains to be seen how and when we're going to bring players through, and Nwaneri is the name on everyone's lips. Now, I am personally of the opinion that if you watch U17 football and draw any conclusions about what that means in any way for being ready to play for the first team, you're making a huge mistake. Okay? They're not even the same universe of sport, let alone a good representation of who's ready. That doesn't stop the hype train, and Nwaneri is certainly on that hype train. We've just seen Omari Hutchinson might be leaving Chelsea for something in the 25 million range, although Chelsea apparently don't want to lose him. And it's just raised questions about how we're managing through the academy. My personal lean is what I care about is Arsenal winning football games. You'd like some of your talent to come from the academy, but usually the really star ones show themselves and they make it. Now, maybe we can convert more academy players into revenue, but I think the real key is just making sure the stars don't slip through your fingers. So where Nwaneri is concerned, do we need to make a path for him to be involved in the first team this season, do you think? Or is it way too early to even be worried about that?
I kind of lean toward it being way too early. He's just turned 17. Like this kid's only just got his GCSE results. We don't really need to worry about where his place is on Edu's magic board of which 8 he covers or anything like that.
Let me tell you a story about a player named Cesc Fabregas.
Well, yeah. Well, I think fans need to temper their expectations a little bit. We've seen Arteta criticised so much for not playing the kids more, right? And there's a couple of instances in really useless games where you think, yeah, maybe him or Lewis Skelly could get on the pitch. But ultimately, I think you have to look at Arsenal over the last 20 years and go, who's brought through more academy graduates than we have? Between the Ashley Coles, the Fabregases, the Wilsheres, the Sakas, the Smith Rowes, we're kind of good for it, If this kid is a star, and he may well be, he will just kick people out the way. Like, you kind of have to trust that the talent will do that. And what I will say is I look at what Fabio Vieira and Smith Rowe gave us last year as kind of reserve eights. It wasn't much in the minutes they were given. There aren't loads of goals and assists in there. And I guess I think we'll hold on to one of those players. I think one of them will go between Smith Rowe and Vieira. And what I'd like to see is that player not being replaced in the squad because Nwaneri moves up. That's the next step for me, is going, as one of those attacking midfielders go, you don't need to sign someone there. You don't need someone else. Keep one of Vieira or Smith Rowe. I mean, if you get offers for both, take them. But I don't think we need to purchase someone, because I think that is slowly where Nwaneri is going to go. And the other thing with Nwaneri is Charlie Patino was the last sort of superstar academy star that coming through with a lot of people talking about him. The problem with Charlie Patino is he still looks like a strong gust of wind would blow him over, and he's nearly 20 years old. At 17, Nwaneri's built like a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. So you'd like to think will be ready for men's football a little bit sooner over the next couple of years or so. But if he was to start a Premier League game next season, that's kind of a miracle at that age, at that level of experience. Because like you say, the football he's playing right now is just a million miles from men's football.
Yeah, this is the danger of the social media age where every game is covered and there's video of every game, and you can see him score a beautiful goal from the right channel for England in the U17 Euros or whatever it is. Like, that's brilliant. And I think he is a brilliant talent. I want to be clear about that. But like, that is not, it's just not even in the universe of being comparable level wise. And like, the worst thing you can do to a player, right, Jacob, is like thrust them into a level they're not ready for when they're on a glide path to stardom. But this is where I do think squad management matters in this respect. When you have Smith Rowe and Nelson and Nketiah, right, and Vieira and Sambi Lokonga and stuff like that, and you get into the League Cup, You kind of got to play those guys because if you don't play them there, when are you going to play them? And so they get those minutes because they have to. You got to use those guys. You can't say, hey, sorry, Nelson, you've had no minutes, but I'm putting this 17-year-old in ahead of you. When you move those kind of players out, you make some room for the 200 minutes there and the 100 minutes here and the 300 minutes there that are in a League Cup or a dead rubber or whatever it is for an academy player to get their debut. And those steps are really important in their career. They really are. And so I think that could happen. One final point I'll just make, and we're going to say goodbye here, is, people talk about like the Eddie minutes. Well, so-and-so can get the Eddie minutes. Very important to note that once Kai became 9, there were no Eddie minutes. And so if Kai is our 9 and starts most games there, and if Jesus stays, which, he may not, but I think he will, and is fit, suddenly, like, if you're buying a striker, you either think he's the guy or he may not play much. So it's all going to be really, really interesting. I think we see a name, we see a YouTube comp, we get excited, we think buy the player. But when you really start to think of how our squad is constructed, this is a really tricky transfer window to get right because the players that will move the needle are few and far between, and the players that don't move the needle may find themselves without a lot of minutes. So we'll have to see how it develops. We'll have a scouting video with Clive tomorrow. You won't want to miss that, but if you do miss that, that's fine because we'll have a pod on Monday. Jacob's on Twitter at Hawley Jacob. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Check him out on that up-and-coming website, YouTube. You're going to love it.
I'm much more Instagram. Jacob Hawley on Instagram.
Check him out on Instagram at Jacob Hawley. He does reels. They're fun. Tim's on Twitter at Stillminator. Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure as always.
My name is Elliot Smith. For the love of God, if this pod hasn't proved it, you can block me on Twitter, Yankee Gunner. LA News will be coming out very, very shortly. Hope to see many of you there. Or if you can't stand us, then I imagine we will not see you there. But, it's all good because it's all love. We love you. And we'll talk to you after Arsenal 10 transfer. No.